Something just changed in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and most people watching this video have no idea it's already reaching into their own backyard. This is not a warning about something that might happen someday. This is happening right now, this month, confirmed by the same government agencies that track hurricanes before they make landfall. And once you understand what's unfolding, you are going to look at the sky differently for the rest of this year. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll know exactly what's building, how strong it's expected to get, and which parts of the world are about to feel it first. Because here's what makes this different from every other weather story you've scrolled past this year. This isn't one meteorologist's opinion. It isn't a single model run that could flip next week. This is a coordinated warning coming from NOAA in the United States, the World Meteorological Organization at the United Nations, Colorado State University's Hurricane Research Team, and an international ensemble of 24 independent forecast models, all pointing at the same conclusion within the same few weeks of each other. When that many separate institutions land on the same answer using completely different data sets, that's the moment you stop calling it a possibility and start calling it a confirmed event. And that's exactly where we are right now. Let's start with the official record, because this is not speculation. In early July 2026, the World Meteorological Organization, the United Nations' own weather authority, put out a direct warning to governments around the planet. El Nino conditions have already formed in the tropical Pacific, and they are forecast to strengthen rapidly between July and September, not next year. Not a distant model projection this quarter. The WMO didn't soften the language either. Their statement said this will intensify the chances of drought and heavy rainfall and raise the risk of heat waves on land and marine heat waves in many regions. When the United Nations uses the word intensify in an official bulletin, that is not filler language. That is a flashing signal for emergency planners, farmers, and coastal communities across dozens of countries. Here's how we got here. For most of 2025, the Pacific was locked in the opposite pattern, La Nina, the cooling phase of this same ocean cycle. Cooler than average water sat across the equatorial Pacific from around mid-2025 through the end of the year. Then something shifted. Starting in December 2025, positive temperature anomalies began creeping in, and they didn't stop. By March through May of 2026, the key monitoring zone in the Pacific, the region scientists call Nino 3-4, was running about half a degree Celsius above average. That number climbed to nearly 1 full degree above average by May, and by the middle of June 2026, the weekly reading had rocketed up to 1.7 degrees Celsius above average. That is not a slow drift. That is a rapid, accelerating warm-up, and it's exactly the kind of trajectory that pushed NOAA to make it official. NOAA's National Weather Service issued a full El Nino advisory confirming that El Nino conditions are present and expected to strengthen into the winter of 2026 into 2027. And here is the number that should get your attention. NOAA's forecasters are putting a 63% chance on this event becoming a very strong El Nino between November 2026 and January 2027. With sea surface temperatures potentially exceeding 2 degrees Celsius above average in the Pacific's core monitoring region. If that threshold gets crossed, NOAA classifies it as very strong. That puts this event in the same tier as the legendary El Ninos of 1997 to 1998 and 2015 to 2016, two events that reshaped weather patterns across entire continents and are still referenced today as benchmark disasters for flooding, drought, and coral reef destruction. And it's not just NOAA saying this. Independent modeling groups are converging on the same conclusion from different angles. The International Research Institute for Climate and Society ran their June 2026 ensemble using 24 separate forecast models, 15 dynamical and 9 statistical, and the agreement across them was described as strong. Nearly every single model shows El Nino strengthening through the rest of 2026 and persisting into early 2027, with almost no chance left on the table for a return to neutral conditions or a La Nina rebound. 13 of those 24 models are now projecting a very strong event by the September to November window. Meanwhile, NOAA's own experimental prediction system out of the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory released its July 2026 outlook, showing continued intensification of what they are now openly calling a very strong El Nino, expected to peak by late fall or early winter. Multiple independent scientific teams using different data, different models, different institutions are all pointing at the same outcome. When that many separate groups converge on one answer, that's not noise, that's signal. Before we go further, let me ask you something, and I genuinely want an answer in the comments. Has your weather already felt strange this year? Hotter than usual out of nowhere, a dry stretch that won't break, or the opposite, rain that just won't stop when it normally would have eased off by now? Tell me your city and your country, because the pattern researchers are describing across completely unrelated parts of the world right now is starting to look remarkably consistent, and I want to see if that lines up with what you're actually living through. So what does a super El Nino actually mean for the world you live in? Let's break this down region by region, because this is where it stops being an abstract ocean statistic and starts becoming your actual weather. Start with the tropics, because that's where El Nino hits hardest and fastest. Indonesia and large parts of Southeast Asia are looking at a drier than normal monsoon season, raising serious concern for rice production in a region that feeds an enormous share of the planet. Australia is bracing for the same story, an increased risk of drought stretching across the continent, along with the elevated wildfire danger that always follows dry vegetation and rising heat. Northern parts of South America, especially the Amazon basin, are expected to see enhanced drought conditions as well, and if you remember the smoke-choked skies and reservoir crises that came out of the last major El Nino, that pattern is the one forecasters are watching for again. Central America is already showing early signs. Honduras has reported a severe drought settling in around its capital region, and climate researchers are directly linking that to the developing El Nino pattern. This is happening already, not in some future forecast window. Now flip to the other side of the coin, because El Nino doesn't just dry places out, it also loads up moisture and dumps it somewhere else. The southwestern United States is in the crosshairs for above-normal rainfall in the July through September outlook, which sounds like relief after dry stretches, but can just as easily tip into flash flooding when it arrives all at once. East Africa is expected to see a wetter than normal rainy season running from September through December, and forecasters are watching an additional climate driver called the Indian Ocean dipole, which could stack on top of El Nino and push East Africa into an even wetter, flood-prone pattern. The World Meteorological Organization has specifically flagged this as a region where the window for preparedness is narrowing, their words, not mine, and where early action on water storage, drainage, and agricultural planning could be the difference between a hard season and a humanitarian emergency. And this is where the story stops being about rain totals and starts being about dinner tables. Research groups tracking this event point out that El Nino-driven droughts hit hardest in regions that are rain-fed, low-income, and already dependent on imported food, meaning the damage doesn't stay local. It turns into higher prices and tighter supply chains that ripple outward. Past El Nino events have been directly linked to depressed rice yields across India and other parts of Asia, a crop that a huge share of the planet depends on daily, and when yields drop, prices climb. Southern Africa has a documented history of reduced cereal production during past El Nino events too. None of this is guaranteed to repeat exactly the same way this time. Every event has its own fingerprint. But the mechanism is well understood, and the early signals, especially out of Central America, and the drought already gripping Honduras, are consistent with the historical pattern. Let's talk about hurricanes, because this is where El Nino creates one of its strangest, most counterintuitive effects. In the Atlantic, El Nino typically increases wind shear, the high-altitude winds that shred storms apart before they can organize. That's why Colorado State University researchers presenting their seasonal outlook this past April projected a below-average Atlantic season for 2026, 13 named storms, and 6 hurricanes. NOAA's own outlook released in May echoed that, predicting below-average Atlantic activity this year specifically because of this El Nino suppression effect. Sounds like good news if you live along the Gulf Coast or the eastern seaboard. But here's the catch that every hurricane scientist wants you to actually absorb. A below-average season does not mean a safe season. It only takes one storm near you to make a season active for you. And history backs that up in a big way. Back in 2023, despite a strong El Nino actively suppressing storm formation, the Atlantic still produced 20 named storms, the 4th most active season on NOAA's record books, because record warm ocean temperatures overpowered the suppression effect. So if you live anywhere along the Gulf or Atlantic coastline, this is not the year to get comfortable just because the seasonal number looks smaller. Meanwhile, on the other side of the country, the eastern Pacific is set up for the opposite story, above-average hurricane activity, because the same El Nino conditions that suppress the Atlantic tend to supercharge storm formation off Mexico's Pacific coast. Now here's where this story stops being about weather maps and starts being about the entire planet's temperature record. Scientists tracking this event are warning that this could become what's known as a super El Nino, a threshold crossed when Pacific temperatures rise more than 2 degrees Celsius above average, according to research compiled by the World Resources Institute. That kind of event doesn't just reshape regional rainfall, it can destabilize entire ocean ecosystems. Past strong El Ninos, 1997 to 1998, and again in 2015 to 2016, were directly linked to major global coral bleaching events. Warmer water stresses coral, disrupts fish migration patterns, damages kelp forests and seagrass meadows, and ripples straight into the livelihoods of coastal and island communities that depend on healthy oceans for food and income. Let's rewind for a second and put this in historical context, because the two names scientists keep bringing up are 1997 to 1998 and 2015 to 2016, and if you lived through either of those years, you already have a rough sense of what strong El Nino conditions can do. The 1997 to 1998 event is still one of the most studied El Ninos in modern record-keeping, tied to catastrophic flooding across parts of South America and severe drought conditions that hit Southeast Asia and Australia simultaneously. The 2015 to 2016 event, the last true super El Nino before this one, was linked to devastating drought across Australia, historic crop failures rippling through southern Africa, and catastrophic flooding events in Peru. Both of those events also triggered major global coral bleaching episodes, damage to reef systems that, in some cases, took years to even partially recover from. Scientists are not saying this event will be an exact repeat. Every El Nino has its own personality, its own timing, its own geographic footprint. But they are saying the intensity signature building right now, that rapid jump in ocean temperatures, that 63% probability of a very strong classification, puts this event in the same weight class as those two historic benchmarks. That's not clickbait language, that's the comparison researchers themselves are making. And then there's the number that ties all of this together, the one that should matter to you no matter where you live. El Nino years tend to correlate with the hottest years on record, globally, because the ocean is releasing stored heat into the atmosphere on top of whatever the planet's baseline temperature already is. The past 10 years are already the hottest 10 years since global temperature records began. Layer a strong El Nino on top of an already elevated baseline, and you get a genuine possibility of new global temperature records being set as this event peaks, heading into winter, and continues its lag effect into 2027. It's worth being precise here because this matters. Climate researchers are clear that El Nino itself typically nudges global average temperatures up by something in the range of 0.2 of a degree Celsius. That's the natural cycle's contribution. The much bigger number, the 1 to 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming compared to pre-industrial levels, that's the long-term fingerprint of decades of greenhouse gas emissions. El Nino is the spike riding on top of a wave that's already rising. That distinction matters because it tells you this isn't a one-year story that resets itself. It's a temporary amplifier sitting on a permanent trend. So what does this mean if you're in Europe watching your own summer play out right now? Here's the honest answer, and I'm not going to inflate this for effect. Analysts tracking this event say El Nino's direct effects on Europe are more indirect and generally milder than what tropical regions are about to experience. It is not expected to meaningfully disrupt Europe's summer of 2026. Where it may show up is later in the year, potentially nudging autumn and early winter toward a milder, wetter, and windier pattern than usual as the broader atmospheric circulation shifts. So if you're in Europe, this is less about your immediate forecast and more about keeping an eye on how your autumn and winter set up later this year. It's also worth pausing on what's actually happening behind the scenes right now, because this isn't just forecasters publishing charts and moving on. The WMO has described its response as an unprecedented mobilization, activating climate information services and early warning systems specifically to help national governments and humanitarian agencies prepare support plans for farmers and vulnerable communities before the worst impacts arrive. One WMO official put it this way: "We have a window to act for preparedness for early action, and this window is narrowing in some regions." That's not a throwaway line in a press release. That's an agency telling the world that the time to prepare water storage, drainage systems, and agricultural contingency plans is measured in weeks, not months, for the regions expected to be hit hardest. Governments in drought-prone and flood-prone regions are being told, directly and publicly, to move now rather than wait for the peak to arrive and react afterward. Where do you live, and has your weather already started feeling different this year? Drop it in the comments, because the pattern people are describing across completely different continents right now is remarkably consistent, and I want to know if it's showing up where you are too. If this gave you a clearer picture of what's actually happening in the Pacific right now, hit like, subscribe so you catch the update when this event peaks later this year, and share this with one person who lives somewhere prone to drought, flooding, or hurricanes. Stay informed, stay ready, and I'll see you in the next one.